Yes. Okay. All right, Chris. I will let you take over.
Cleared for takeoff.
All right.
Okay, let's see if this works. All right, are you seeing my screen now?
Absolutely.
Okay, then we'll go to slideshow. Start from the beginning. Okay, are you looking at the title page?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the introduction. Again, I'm Chris Best with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I have the euphemistic title of state botanist, which is our only botanist in the state, although we recently hired a new botanist who may be with us tonight. The talk is on native grasses and grasslands. And I do want to reiterate that after discussion, Deb and I thought that it would be fine if just ask questions at any time, and then she'll kind of coordinate the questioning. So I will depend on Deb to kind of signal me and say, okay, let's take a break for questions.
Where's
The photograph on the title page here is of Kirchhoff Prairie in Wilson County. And this site 10 years ago was a cornfield. And the Kirchhoff family worked with me and NRCS people to restore a native grassland at that site. And they did a great job, and it's been very successful. And I'll talk about that towards the end when we get into management and restoration. Some of the dominant grasses you see there are four-flower trichloris, which is a native grass which ranges from just south of San Antonio all the way to South America. And it has a very good forage value, and is one of the few South Texas native grasses that will hold its own against some of the introduced grasses. So we ask, what are grasslands? And the question came up at various times during the presentation. And actually, I found it very difficult to separate the different themes that I want to talk about. So they're kind of all interwoven. So just hang on to this question of what is a grassland, but we can at least agree that a common element of grasslands is they have a predominant cover of grasses. And of course, grasslands around the world and grasslands in Texas are very diverse vegetation types. There's many different sorts of grasslands. So now we have to consider, what is a grass? Well, botanists would say, oh, well, a grass is a member of the Poaceae, the grass family. They have certain characteristics in common, such as, they're monocots. So when they germinate, there's a single seed leaf. The venation is parallel. They have hollow stem internodes. The vascular tissue, the xylem and phloem, is arranged in bundles rather than concentrically around the stem. And the flowers, the inflorescences are arranged in panicles, and they have a very specialized kind of flower with parts arranged in threes. So here we see a view of a native grass of South Texas, hairy panicum. You can see a panicle on it. And to the right, you see various types of panicle arrangement. So as we begin to talk about grass identification, the arrangement and type of panicle is going to be a very important part of identification. So the various panicle types, and I realize some of the text there is hard to read, so I'm going to read it for you. Oh, and I did forget one thing. Now, can people see me? If you can see me, a little thumbnail of me. I forgot to introduce some of the books that I wanted to talk about. It used to be, for quite a long time, Frank Gould's book, let me see if I can get that, The Grasses of Texas, was, you know, our old standby. And you can see this one has been so thoroughly used, it's fallen to pieces. And a few years back, Shaw came out with this book of The Guide to Texas Grasses. And I think you can pick it up off of Amazon for a lot less than the size would have you believe. But this is a terrific resource if you really want to get into grasses. And a bit later, there's quite a lot that's been written about prescribed burning. This is just one resource. Sifries and Hamilton, prescribed burning for rangeland management. Okay, so those are my book introductions. Going back to our panicle types, some of the major types of panicles in the upper left and upper right, these are examples of spikes or spicate panicles. And then the lower two on the left are racemes. So you see the spikelets, which are the clusters of flowers, are borne off of a central stalk on short lateral branches. And then the two examples on the lower right would be considered spicate racemes. So it's kind of in between the two. So the spikelet itself is the basic unit of grass identification. So you see on the middle and right, two examples of individual spikelets on Texas grass and slim tridents. Texas grass, by the way, is an endemic species. It's found only in loose sandy soils from Padre Island inland through the South Texas sand sheet. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's a really beautiful grass. Anyway, spikelets. So on the left side, and I think, let me see can you see my cursor, Deb? Can you see that moving around? So a spikelet can have one to many florets. Okay, where did my cursor go? I lost it again. Okay, there we go. So a floret is an individual grass flower, and these individual flowers are arranged, one to many will be composed into a spikelet. So the spikelet, if all the parts are present, will have this sequence of modified leaves in whorls. So from the outer to the inner whorls, you have the first gloom, which you see right here, the second gloom, then you have a lemma surrounding one of the florets, and then a palea, and then finally you have the anthers, and then the stigmas in the very center. The stigma will have 3 lobes, and there are 3 anthers. But if fertilized, it will only bear a single seed, which is usually called a caryopsis. So again, in this spikelet, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 florets. And then in the diagram, they're showing a reduced floret. Now, where grass identification starts to get very tricky is that some of these parts may not be present. So if the first gloom is missing, you find, and you really need to have a dissecting microscope or a good, magnifying glass to identify grasses. So you're peeling things apart and you find this thing, which is a modified leaf, and you think, oh, that's the first gloom. Well, it could be the second gloom, and the first gloom is missing. Now that gets really tricky, right? Oh, but it gets better. So these are examples of two fairly specialized subfamilies. The Panicoideae is on the left, so that would include panic grasses, and the Andropogonoideae is on the right, and that would include examples like big bluestem, little bluestem, Indian grass, and as well as old world bluestems. So in the Andropogonoideae, you have a sessile spikelet, meaning it has no stem, and then there's a pedicellate spikelet above it. And in many members of this subfamily, only the sessile spikelet is fertile, and the pedicellate spikelet is sterile. So you may, or it may only have stamens. So you ask, what is it there for? What are we here for? But anyway, so, and then the Panicoideae, that gets really tricky too, because all the little parts are wrapped around each other so tightly that, you really have to work with some very fine tweezers to peel the parts apart. And you'll find, you see in the diagram, what you think is a single floret, there's actually a reduced floret kind of hidden inside all these tightly wrapped parts. So just be on the lookout for these little tricks. And I'm going to give another example. Many of you may be familiar with big bluestem. It's a large and an extremely important grass of the Great Plains. It reaches the southern extent of its range here in Texas. Historically, I think there may have been some in northern Mexico. It can be really big. I've found some big bluestem in South Texas near Sarita. If you're familiar, if you go down Highway 77, and in the first few miles after the Sarita checkpoint, you'll find some beautiful stands, remnant stands of big bluestem, Indian grass, switchgrass. And that's like the last southernmost place you'll see those species. And in those areas, I have found big bluestem with stems that are about 10 feet tall. Oh, I think I accidentally, okay, back to the slide. And here's a shot of a big bluestem flower in anthesis. So here's the anther, anthesis, flowering. This anther probably already shed its pollen. And here's the stigma. The stigma will come out after the anther, and it is, once it's out, it's receptive to pollen and to fertilization. And then after it's fertilized, everything kind of shrivels back inside that floret. Now take a look at this picture of, went away again, no, page up. Look in the lower right. And so you're peeling apart these spikelets of big bluestem, and you see the sessile fertile spikelet. It's obvious enough. And if there's a seed present, it will be inside that thing. But what are those other two things sticking out? Well, it turns out those are the pedicels of sterile spikelets that aren't even there. So when you're trying to key out these grasses, you'll get to these categories that will say that it has, one or more sterile spikelets. And so then, you spend the next hour going through this key looking for all the grasses that have sterile spikelets. And if you ever do find big bluestem, it'll say, oh, the sterile spikelets aren't actually there. They're just reduced to a pedicel and a rachis. So those are some more of the challenges of grass identification. I wish somebody would think of a better way, right? And I want to take a sidebar on big bluestem because it is such an important grass, and it is greatly reduced in central Texas. It's, it would have been in pre-settlement times a very obvious member of our grass flora. And in many cases where I found it, you just have isolated colonies. Well, now there's a problem there because those colonies may actually be clones of individual plants that are reproducing vegetatively. But big bluestem is an obligate outcrosser. It must be fertilized by an unrelated individual. So you find this, you find a clump of this grass and you think, oh, great, I found some, I'm going to collect some seeds. Well, all those wonderful flowers that you collect won't have seeds in them if they're not being pollinated by an unrelated individual. The next nearest unrelated individual could be miles away. So, and big bluestem, incidentally, has some of the most complex genetics I've ever heard of. In an individual colony, there can be hexaploids, meaning there are, human beings have 2 sets of chromosomes. We're very boring, la-di-da. They can have 6 sets of chromosomes, or in the same population, there can be individuals that have 9 sets of chromosomes. And there are individuals with 12 sets of chromosomes. And then thrown in there, you'll have individuals that are aneuploids, which have uneven sets. The aneuploids are completely sterile. And most of the seeds are actually produced when a hexaploid fertilizes another hexaploid. So very complicated. But, plants are they're just a lot more interesting than, animals are, we're all kind of boring, really. Just boy meets girl and that's done. This is going to be a quiz plant for you. Now, I know a lot of you will recognize the plant on the left is Buffle Grass. And you recognize the left and middle is Buffalo Grass. And on the right is Bermuda Grass. And you can recognize them readily by their inflorescences. And incidentally, another sidebar, buffalo grass is one of the very few grasses in the world that has separate male and female plants. So it's dioecious. That's really cool. I mean, even corn is an unusual grass because it has separate male and female inflorescences, but they're on the same plant. In buffalo grass, they're on different plants. Another sidebar that I love about buffalo grass, and many of you may know this, but the species got its name because it was often found around buffalo wallows in the prairies. So the buffalo wallows have, heavy clay soil where water would impound after rain. And that brought the buffalo in, of course. And the buffalo, since they wanted to spend some time there, it was like a playground for them. They would, heavily graze everything. Well, buffalo grass is very, very tolerant both of trampling and heavy grazing. And that's what makes it a great lawn grass. It can be mowed very, very low. It doesn't care. You can walk on it. You can drive on it. It's one of the most tolerant grasses to trampling. Now look at that in the center picture, you see the female inflorescence. Now, again, very unusual grass. And by the way, it's a grama grass. It's a Bouteloua, so it's related to side oats grama, the state grass of Texas. It's related to red grama and blue grama and black grama and all those. But look at how that female inflorescence is contracted, and it's actually not at the top of a culm. it's way down it's in a lateral, the axil of a lower leaf. And each inflorescence is contracted down into this almost woody structure called a burr. And within each burr, there can be up to 10 seeds. Now, the buffalo would, of course, graze everything around these wallows, and they would pick up some of these burrs, but the burrs are so hard they wouldn't get ground up. And they pass through the buffalo's intestinal tract and come out nicely scarified. And we know another thing about buffalo grass seeds is they require high nitrate levels to germinate. Now that's interesting, because if you were to germinate in a fresh buffalo dropping, there would be very high levels of ammonia nitrogen. And if you germinated in that, you'd be burned. It's just too strong. But over a period of time, soil microorganisms will invade that buffalo patty and will oxidize the ammonia nitrogen to nitrate nitrogen. And so plants that are stimulated, this is my personal hypothesis, we know of a number of plants that are stimulated to germinate by high levels of nitrate. And my hypothesis is this is a way that the seed signals that the medium that it was transported in, a great big pile of poo, is now safe for germination. And another plant that has this nitrate stimulation is chili pekin. So I don't know how many of you have attempted to grow chili pekin. Many people find the seeds are very stubborn and dormant and don't want to germinate. If you can get a hold of some potassium nitrate, you put about a teaspoon per quart of water and soak them in that for a couple of days, and then plant them, and they will come up. They also like to be rained on. Now, that was all a giant divergence, and we go back to our quiz plant. So you can tell buffalo grass from Bermuda grass when they're flowering, but how do you tell them apart when they're sterile? Does anybody have any ideas? So this would be a good opportunity to ask a question. Deb, do we have any takers?
I don't have anyone yet. Nobody's
Well,
brave.
I am anxious to hear what observations you may have, but a gentleman at the North American Butterfly Association National Butterfly Center south of Mission told me that he had noticed that in Bermuda grass, if you look at the middle upper picture, even out towards the ends of the stolons, those branches that run out on top of the ground, even the youngest leaves are fairly long, okay? And in buffalo grass, the further out you get along that stolon, the shorter the leaves become. So that's one way. And another thing that I noticed is that in every buffalo grass I've seen, if you look at the stolons and you look at the nodes, each node will have 2 or more branches coming out. But in Bermuda grass, you generally see no more than 1. And finally, since buffalo grass is a Bouteloua, if you get a magnifying glass and you look at this is a blade. So the sheath of the blade is, the part of the leaf that surrounds the culm, the stem, is called the sheath. And then the part of the leaf that extends outward is the blade. And if you look at the lower portion of the blade along the margins, they have what are called papilla-based hairs. Ooh, that's a nice term. Anyway, unfortunately, they're little hard to see in buffalo grass, but yeah, anyway, it's worth considering. Now let's talk more about grasses and how they evolved and what their specialty is. Well, think about fire. Fire is inevitable on this planet. As we are seeing, as I speak, there must be well over 1 million acres of forests burning in the Western United States following the unprecedented high temperatures and droughts. Fire happens. Well, the first grasses were bamboo-like plants that evolved at least about 120 million years ago. And they, since they lived in places that burned often enough, they evolved an adaptation to fire in that the centers of growth are actually at the base of the plant. And so the upper portion of the plant can burn and the plant is able to resprout. And grasses, and I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay, so this is actually buffle grass, one of our most hated introduced grasses. If you love nature, if all you're interested in is growing livestock, it's not too bad. These buds that come off of the base of the, really the root crown, see, these are roots coming out, these are stems coming up, and right at the juncture of root and stem, a bud can form, and it forms a new unit that is called a phytomere, or often we just call them tillers. And also you'll see on another one of our most loved invasive grasses, Johnson grass, you see a rhizome, okay? And both the rhizomes and these phytomeres are means of vegetative reproduction. So you remember I talked about the big bluestem and how one colony can actually be a single individual. Well, these phytomeres is how that happens. They just keep budding off a new unit that becomes a stem. And what grasses do is each phytomere sort of lives almost like an annual plant. Once it's released from dormancy, it grows, photosynthesizes, gathers energy, and then it flowers and it makes seeds and dies. Similar to, the agaves that you're familiar with are also monocots, and they have the same game plan. They can make vegetative buds to the side, and even though an individual may live for decades, once it flowers, it's done. But its vegetative offshoots can continue to live. So what the grasses evolved to do, they not only adapted to be able to survive fire, but it's almost as if, sometimes you almost think that species are plotting their own evolution, and so once the culms have grown, they produce seeds, and then they dry out and they are perfect fuel. So wherever grasses tend to grow, fire is very likely to happen. And what that does is it knocks back the plants that grasses compete with, which are mainly woody plants. So very devious, right? They're not just surviving fire, they're making it happen. This map shows the wildland pre-settlement fire return intervals. So this is a result of lots and lots of research by lots of people. Now, I know it's hard to read the key at the bottom. So the pink areas are places that had a less than 35-year fire return with low to moderate severity. The deeper red is also less than 35 years with high severity. And at the other end of the spectrum, the green areas had a greater than 200-year interval of any severity. And, you know, we can see out there along the Pacific coast and in the Sierras and the Rocky Mountains, there's a lot of areas there that pre-settlement had a greater than 200-year fire interval, and that has been reduced in recent decades. Okay. Anyway, you can see that a huge swath of the United States had very frequent fires. And when we say less than 35 years, we know that there's a lot of communities where fire would happen probably on the average every 5 years or less. So both the plants and the animals of grasslands are adapted to fire. And interestingly enough, both fire and grazing are important for maintaining grasslands and stimulating new growth. First of all, the fire will tend to knock back woody plants, and natural fires, as well as the grazing of animals like bison, create these very irregular patterns, very kind of random, chaotic patterns through the vegetation. And wherever they occur, the subsequent vegetation is different from the areas that didn't burn or weren't grazed. So grasslands, naturally functioning grasslands, can be very, very diverse ecosystems, very patchy. Another sidebar that I want to explore, back in 2000, the Society for Ecological Restoration had their international conference in Austin, and I got to go. And one of the very memorable presentations I saw, and I can't remember who gave it, but it was a researcher from Australia who is comparing the methods of prescribed burning of Anglo-Australians and Indigenous Australians. And there was one principal difference. The Anglo-Australians did prescribed burning as backfires. They would start with a fire break and light a fire that burned into the wind, okay? And these fires, they're a little easier to manage. They move a lot more slowly. They're not as hot where they're burning, but the heat lasts a lot longer because the fire moves slower. And the result is a much more thorough eradication of woody plants. So that's what the ranchers in Australia want. Now, the indigenous people say, no, no, this is very wrong. And they light head fires. So they start with their fire break and start a fire and then go off and have lunch. And they let the wind push that fire. And they say that this is much better because wild animals in Australia, once they smell that smoke, they go straight up the eucalyptus trees. And a head fire moves through so quickly that they're not, they have a high survival rate. But a backfire takes too long, and many of the animals, the koalas and things that you might want to eat someday if you lived there, they don't make it. But the other thing that the indigenous people really liked about head fires, and if you've ever watched if you've ever investigated a place that burned where a wildfire burned naturally, is the burn patterns are very irregular. Fire, and I recently, just in June, I was able to collect data up in the Chisos Mountains where there was a fire in April, and it was a natural fire. And it's quite amazing how you can see an area where the burn severity was actually very high, and a stone's throw away, you'll find a place that didn't burn at all. So head fires create a lot of, again, a lot of patchiness. And each one of those patches will respond differently depending on whether it burned and how severely it burned. and that influences the vegetation that grows there in the following seasons. So head fires lead to more diverse plant communities. Okay, questions, answers?
Chris, I do have one question that came in earlier, and it's not about fires, but it is about big bluestem that you've mentioned a couple times. Somebody asked about if you're purchasing seeds of big bluestem from a major seed catalog, are there not problems with them avoiding some of the isolated colonies, or is there some safety measures, I guess, that are in place when collecting those?
That's a wonderful question. And it's actually a controversial topic that among people who are in the business of producing native plant seeds commercially, or in the business of restoring native vegetation, you get into this topic, and after a few beers, a fist fight could easily break out. And so the big Indians and the little Indians of this Lilliput are whether or not you sell your seed on a per weight basis or a pure live seed basis. Now, I'm a big Indian. I believe that it is much more useful to sell and purchase seeds on the basis of pure live seed. And what that means is that the seller is telling you that, you know, this for $10 or 20 or whatever it is, this is how many live seeds you're going to get. Now, from one year to the next, the concentration or amount of pure live seeds per pound of stuff, it will vary. But they don't sell it on a per weight basis. They sell it on the pure live seed basis. So when you are planning your restoration, you want to plant 100 acres with, you know, tall grass prairie with big bluestem in it. And you can calculate, okay, I want big bluestem to be, you know, 10% of my composition. You know how much seed to order. But there are some other producers who may have, you know, really great stuff to sell, but they will only sell it to you on a per pound basis. And in order, you'll have to get them, once you buy the seed, then you can get from them an analysis, because the law will require them to state what the pure live seed content is, right? But you basically will find that out after you buy the seed. So you may find that you need to buy more because that year's seed lot didn't have as much. But I will say all the growers of big bluestem are aware of the problems of low seed fill. I mean, I've looked at natural stands of big bluestem where you had 1% seed fill, maybe 10%. And another thing that happens with big bluestem is that a lot of the seeds are parasitized by the larva of a midge. And that's another benefit of burning, whether it's natural or prescribed, is that at least in theory, periodically, if a stand of big bluestem burns, the midge population declines, and so you get a better seed fill. But anyway, that's a very interesting topic. Any other questions?
Nothing else so far, although somebody was very interested. They found it very humorous about beer drinking fights over grass seeds, but.
Oh, yes. And I mean, my nose is not crooked for nothing. But but anyway, carrying on. Here you see on the left a native coastal grassland that we find on the lomas, which are these wind-blown hills in the Boca Chica region, right near the mouth of the Rio Grande. So here's the Rio Grande, here's the Brownsville Ship Channel. So this is a type of grassland. You'll find a lot of yuccas and a very unusual lily there, Lila de las Lomas, Echeandia texensis. Almost the entire world's population of this species is right here in Boca Chica. Here's a view that many of you would be familiar with. It's looking off the porch of the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and you're looking at a vegetation type, a community where grasses and other herbaceous plants and woody plants are co-dominant. So loosely defined, or sensu lato, this is a savanna. Now you get into academic types, and you can get into more fist fights about what is and isn't a savanna, and it has to be that. But the way most people would define it, it's just a community where grasses and herbaceous plants are co-dominant with woody plants. Now think of the influence of fire and fire frequency on a vegetation type like this. With increased burning, a lot of these smaller woody plants might be killed outright, or they would be knocked back. These live oaks, the outer branches would burn off, and the plant would, lose maybe 10 feet of growth. And if fire is more frequent, the woody portion of the vegetation recedes. If it's less frequent, it expands. And if it doesn't occur at all, it will probably fill in all those gaps until it becomes a forest. And so, I find it convenient to think of the savanna really as the predominant native vegetation type, certainly in many parts of Texas and much of the world. And forest and prairie or grassland are the two extremes. And they're just influenced by the amount of the frequency of fire and the influence of grazing animals. Here's another very typical Edwards Plateau scene. This one is in southwestern Bandera County. Again, the photograph was taken in the direction of the arrow. This is what I call a subtropical shrub savanna at Santa Ana National Wildlife Refuge, just right on the Rio Grande in southern Hidalgo County. If you've never been there, it's a really amazing place. They consider it the jewel of the wildlife refuge system. How much savanna and grassland existed in pre-settlement times, and how much is left? Well, I did a little exercise here where I just looked at Frank Gould's ecoregions of Texas, which he created many years ago, and they're still in use today. So when you look at the ecoregions which were predominantly grassland or savanna, about 81% of Texas, over 550 square kilometers, were grassland or savanna. And now looking at major vegetation types as defined by McMahon in 1984, the highlighted yellow areas are dominated by introduced grasses. Oh, well, okay, let's see. I may be misinterpreting my own slide. Introduced and native grasslands make up 11%, or 75,000 square kilometers. Savanna, as I define it, makes up another 127,000 square kilometers. Shrubland. So in areas where shrubby vegetation has pretty much closed in, then we call that shrubland. And of course, cropland takes up a very large area. Well, the influence of grasses on soils over time, because of their frequent burning, creates a type of soil called mollisols. And mollisols have a lot of unburned carbon in them. And that makes them able to store large amounts of nutrients. So where there have been grasslands, you have good agricultural soils. And so a lot of grasslands have been plowed up to feed us. So the end result is that Texas has lost about 86 million acres of grassland and savanna, an area larger than Kansas and Louisiana combined. So obviously, we have to conclude that conservation of native grasslands is a high conservation priority. But the situation is even more dire than that, because so many of our remaining grasslands are heavily invaded by introduced grasses from the old world, including buffle grass on the upper left, guinea grass on the right, and old world bluestems, which include King Ranch bluestem, Clayburgh bluestem, and others. In fact, in South Texas, you would be hard pressed to find, Bill Neiman of Native American Seed once asked me if he knew of any stands of native grass in South Texas that were large enough to justify him bringing down his combine. And he said, no, I need stands that, really don't have introduced grasses. And I said, Bill, you won't even find a place to park your combine. I mean, it's down to handfuls. Now, what about all the other plants that live in grasslands? Well, many of them are also very well adapted to fire and may be fire dependent. In fact, there's a lot of herbaceous plants of grasslands that we call fire followers that we typically see in the first few years after a fire and then decline. Now, that's been observed for a very long time, but nobody knew why. In 2004, these really astute biochemists in Australia looked into this, and they published this wonderful paper about how they discovered these substances called carricins, which they invented the word from an indigenous Australian word. And carricins are produced whenever cellulose burns. Even, you could burn filter paper and you get small amounts of carricins. And there are plants that are stimulated to germinate when carricin levels are in the part per billion levels. So vegetation burns, there's some carricin produced, it rains, that dissolves in the soil solution, and seeds that have the right enzyme system, and they've now actually identified the genes responsible for the carricin response. And so the carricin signals the seed, you've been dormant for 50 years, guess what? It's time to germinate, and they come up. So it's quite amazing. Subsequently, other chemical messengers that come from fire have also been discovered. This is a photograph of a prescribed burn we did on a private land in near Navasota, Texas, which essentially has probably the only good stand of Agellinus navasotensis left. It covers about 2 acres on a sandstone outcrop. The population had declined for many years. The landowners said, go ahead, do a burn. We burned it. And the next year, the population of the species exploded and made huge amounts of seeds. And then as the years passed, gradually declined, and we did another burn in 2016. So incidentally, this species is now under review by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it may be listed as a threatened or endangered species in the coming year. Here's another species that's currently under review. We will announce a decision on the species very soon. This is bracted twistflower, which many of you should be familiar with because it would occur near New Braunfels and elsewhere. And there's reason to believe that this species is also a fire follower, and that the lack of fire in the Edwards Plateau has been one of the factors that has led to its decline. I told this to a very motivated volunteer named Walter Stewart. Some of you may have met him. He is a certified mad scientist. I mean, I'm telling you, one look at him and you know he's a mad scientist. And so he got a hold of some dormant bracted twist flower seeds and he soaked them in a solution of liquid smoke and got a 5-fold increase in germination. He later repeated that experiment with Caracan-infused filter paper. So it's looking very much like bracted twist flower is indeed a fire-following species, like most of the other members in its clade of the genus Streptanthus. Those that are not in its clade are serpentine endemics. This is for people that get into that, if you like to throw out, it's like cocktail party words. Another one of my favorite rare plants, an endangered species of South Texas and Northeast Mexico, is the Tamalepin kidney petal. Tamalepin kidney petal can occur in a lot of different soils. We're kind of hard pressed to explain why it's so rare, but the one thing that we notice is where it does well is neither in the open grasslands nor in the dense brushlands, but at the edge of brush mottes. And so one hypothesis is that these shrub savanna habitats, as too many livestock were brought in, too much grazing, and no fire, the shrub portion of the vegetation grew until all the shrub mottes coalesced. What happens then? There's no more edge. And if there's no more edge, Tamalepin kidney petal has lost its niche. I'm skipping this section in the last part of my talk, which, by the way, we don't have to go through. We can stop at any time. So, Deb, how are we with time?
I would say about 10 minutes.
Perfect. So the last section is on grassland restoration and management. And just to compare and contrast, basically restoration is where we are reestablishing a species or a population where it may have occurred in the past, but no longer occurs. And there are various techniques that can be used. Management is where the vegetation type exists, but it may be declining. And so we're going to conduct various operations to try to bring it back. So here you see some of the types of equipment that can be used for a larger scale grassland restoration. This is a project that I got to work on. If you see the photograph in the upper right, the gentleman driving the tractor was Dr. Ashley Mcallen. He had property in southwestern Bandera County. He had 85 acres of cropland that he used to raise, I think it's called haymaster sorghum. And he told me that in a lot of years, the value of the forage he produced was not greater than the cost of planting it. And he was a little frustrated with that. And I had talked to him about, well, why don't you try native grasslands? It can be a little more expensive to establish, but once it's established, you just manage it. You don't have to plant it. And after a few years, he said, and actually after the drought of 2011, he said, you know what, I want to try the natives. And so, and we had gotten funding through our Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, which if any of you have land and you are considering some sort of management, prescribed burning, et cetera, consider getting in touch with our partners program. We may be able to cost share with you and help you along the way. So that's what Dr. Mcallens and I did. This was one of the funnest projects I've worked on. It got me out of the office for many days over the next few years. You can see we had a problem. I forgot to tell him that this specialized drill that we're going to use requires a hydraulic system. His tractor did not have a hydraulic system. I did not know they made tractors that did not have hydraulic systems. But anyway, there we were with, you know, thousands of dollars worth of seed and 85 acres of land. And we're paying to rent this thing by the day. And we had to do something. So with no hydraulics, he couldn't lift it. So we could never turn the tractor. So what we did is we just planted every field concentrically around and around and around. So the tractor never had to turn around. You know, you didn't have to lift it up and, you know, the way tractors typically go back and forth. And we found it challenging to line the tractor up because the planter is behind you. And so Dr. Mcallen just got a piece of PVC and tied it, just lashed it to the front of the machine. And so you can see the end of the pipe is even with the last planted row. And so that's how we lined the tractor up. And we took turns driving it. It took about 3 days. It was just absolutely the most fun I've had in a long time. But if you do native grass and grassland planting, don't try to use a grain drill or anything else. You really do need specialized equipment. The seed sources, again, this has been a problem in the past, but beginning in 2000, South Texas Natives Project, which is a program of A&M Kingsville, began a program of finding these remnant stands of native grasses and wildflowers, doing the initial development, and then getting commercial growers to produce these. You can now go to a commercial seed company and buy truckloads of native grasses that are adapted to your region of Texas. And that has really made it possible. You know, when I first started in this field in the 1990s, we could talk about native grassland restoration, but we couldn't do it because you couldn't get the seeds. You could hand collect seeds and plant maybe your backyard, but you're talking about planting 1,000 acres, it could not be done. So that can now be done, and South Texas Natives has expanded into Texas Native Seeds, and they have programs in different parts of the state. As a general rule, you would like to plant seeds where the initial ecotype collection came within your ecoregion. So I find, again, Gould's ecoregions are good guidelines. And part of Dr. Mcallens Land, we saw this picture before, we wanted to plant these little plots, and I think there were like 20 little plots in this savanna that would be enriched with pollinator species. This place had been heavily overgrazed in the past. It was quite depleted. He wanted to bring it back. Oops, I accidentally changed. And here we used a purpose-built, specialized drill that our friends at Natural Resources Conservation Service in Kingsville loaned to us. Didn't just loan, they brought it out and they operated it. John Riley was the driver there. And this thing was a little 4-row planter, and we were able to plant all these little plots. And the following year I came out and collected data, and yes, you could see the native pollinator plants coming up in each one of these plots. Another approach that's been taken, you know, instead of buying seeds from a company, and the Burlesons in Bell County, they started working on grassland restoration back in the 70s, and there were no sources of seeds at all, but they knew here and there of little patches of native grass and prairie plants. And so what they would do is they would go at various times of the year and just harvest basically like hay. I mean, they would just cut everything that was there and then take it back to an old cotton field that they wanted to restore. And then they would just spread this stuff on the landscape and just pack it in a little bit. And it worked very well. And the Burleson Prairie is an amazing piece of land. And it is unusually rich in wildflower species that you rarely see in prairie restorations, especially in Texas.
Chris, can I interject for a second? I have a question that you might enjoy. Somebody asked if with proper management, will a restored area resist the return of invasive non-native grasses?
Well, that is a great question and probably could be a whole nother hour-long presentation. I mean, I would say cautiously, yes, this is possible. One example is these old world bluestems. Okay, so if we consider King Ranch bluestem, there's research going back, started in the late 90s by a wonderful British ecologist who worked at the Wildflower Center. I'm having a mental block and I'm trying to remember his name. Someone will know his name because he was just a terrific guy. And he found that when you did a late summer burn, which is when our grasslands did burn most often, the introduced old world bluestems declined and the native grasses and wildflowers benefited and increased their cover. And conversely, if you burn during the winter, which is typically when people do burn in Texas, if they burn at all, because it's a little safer, when you do a winter burn, the old world bluestems increase, the natives decrease. So it's a much more complex question than can management hold off the invasives. So now the very closely related Clayburgh bluestem, I'm not sure if that pattern holds, whether a summer burn would effectively knock it back or not, but I don't think we have anything to go on with that one. So very complex question. Anyway, in the last my dwindling remaining minutes, I had mentioned the Kirchhoff Prairie, which again was a cornfield. In 2012 and 2013, the Kirchhoffs planted this area. They followed our instructions to the letter. These people know how to work. They worked really hard and they did a beautiful job and they're continuing to work on it. And actually they have monthly work days on the prairie. If you love going out and, it's kind of like a Chigger survey, see if you love that kind of thing. I've been out on many occasions. You can go out and help them control Huisache infestation, old world bluestems, and so forth. But really fascinating stuff, and they've got a lot of research going on there. Again, looking into the effect of fire on the old world bluestems. Referring again to our grassland restoration with McAllen and Bandera County, you can see here just some of the details. We had calibrated this machine very carefully, and let's see, I'm trying to see, 95 pounds, 16 native. When we finished the planting, we had just I think it was 2.5 pounds of seeds out of, I can't remember. I think it says on there, but I can't read it. But I think we started with something in excess of 500 pounds of seeds, and we had 2.5 pounds left when we finished, which we then just replanted in some of the areas. But that, I was very proud of my ability to calibrate the equipment. Nobody cares. Anyway, I thought it was cool. But here's Dr. McAllen again at the wheel of his tractor. I make a special tribute to him. He passed away very untimely in 2017. And it was a great loss because he had told me his plan was to use his land as a demonstration area for natural resources conservation. And he intended to spend the rest of his life promoting good land management practices in the area. And that is what we need. You get some, weird guy from Fish and Wildlife Service going around, telling everybody what to do. Nobody's going to listen to me except for people like him. But when landowners themselves and the Kirchhoffs and people like that, when they adopt these practices, there's 1,000 other people that are going to learn about it, and many of them will become interested in practicing this. Mcallens' goal was that these crop field, these hay fields that weren't doing anything for him, would become not just, they would be both productive for his livestock, but also would be great pollinator habitats. And 3 years, you know, we did everything wrong. I misadvised him so many different times and ways, and we screwed up, and the weather was horrible and just wouldn't cooperate. But after about 3 years, it actually did start to look like a real prairie. And there was lots of pollinator plants in it. Some of them we planted, some of them came up on their own. And 5 years after we planted it, they were actually grazing it. And I believe they still are. So I was a little ashamed at, you know, that it took 5 years to get where he wanted to go. He was very happy with it. So, you know, that counts for me. And we actually saw large numbers of monarchs utilizing the habitat as they migrated through in the fall. That's the end of my talk. So more time for questions.
I don't see anything else right now. Anybody have questions? If Chris is
I was
willing-
wondering, did that Mr. McAllen or that property, did he use fire as a management tool there?
We talked about it, and initially he was like, all right, yeah, I've heard that. Yeah, I understand that. I don't think we're going to be doing that here. He and his brother had some accidental fires on the property, and he was worried about the litigation. And subsequently, every time I would go out there several times a year, and we would have these little sessions, and he would just query me, and we'd talk. And he was coming around, and he was like, all right, let's talk about fire again. So I knew we were headed in the right direction. And there are outfits that are, you can contract to do prescribed burning. Now, the real trick is the insurance. And recently I was told there was kind of a setback on that, but they're working around it. But that's the thing is, you've got to get a team of qualified burn team, and they've got to be able to, get insurance. The people in our Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, in my office, and at the Balcones Canyonlands National Wildlife Refuge, are top-notch prescribed burn people. And they actually do a fair amount of burning on private land through various agreements that we have. So it can be done. Obviously, it gets a lot trickier as you get more and more development and, all the 10-acre ranchettes and all that. So anyway, but even the city of Austin has some properties where they burn. So it can be done. More questions?
I had a comment, just kind of a reminder to people, and I guess maybe an affirmation for you, that we always tell people when we sell native plants and we encourage native plants about this sleep, creep, leap rule, that it can take at least 3 years for your native plants to truly become established, that they have to be patient. So somebody just added that reminder, and lots of thank yous to you. Wonderful talk.
Many thank yous in return for actually lasting this long without throwing anything at me. Oh, that's right, you can't. I'll share this anecdote because this was kind of fun. So, all right, so Dr. McAllen and I planted his areas, And, like I say, things were not going well. We had a huge amount of star thistle out there. That's one that we were controlling or attempting to control by letting it flower, but before it set seed, I would have him shred the areas. And he said, how long, am I gonna have to do this every spring? And I said, I don't know. But anyway, a year had gone by and he's like, I went out there to collect data and he said, I came in and he goes, okay, what's the report? He said, I'm not seeing much out there. And I said, come with me and I want to show you what I'm seeing. So we drive out there and I said, just drive your pickup truck and park anywhere. So we drove. He says, is this good? I said, I don't care, just stop anywhere. So we stop, we get out. And I say, now, this grass right here, this is side oats grama. This is a good grass. This is a good forage grass. You planted it. This is seed that we bought. And he said, okay, that's good. But the soil was largely bare and you couldn't see much. And I said, now, keep your eye on that inflorescence, the flower stalk. Now I want you to kneel down to the ground level. He said, why? What's going on? I said, just kneel down. And he knelt down. I said, now look horizontally. And he looked around. He said, yee-haw! And he saw what I saw, because when you got in the right plane, you could see that side oats grama was coming up all over the place. But the individual plants were, they might be 6 or 8 feet apart. And he said, but how do we fill it? His question had been, do we need to buy more seed and plant this again? And I said, Mcallen, you don't need to buy more seed. There it is. The plants that you put out are making more seed for you. And, and there was a number, and then one by one I said, now this is, this is the green sprangle top, and here's your buffalo grass. Little patches of buffalo grass were coming up. And then there were some of the pollinator plants were evident. And so he was that was the first time when he kind of heaved a sigh of relief that this whole investment of time and money was headed in the right direction.
That's very encouraging. I try to remind myself of the same thing on my tiny scale of my backyard, and little bit by little bit.
It was a fascinating talk, Chris. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Mickey.
Yeah, thank you so
Anytime.
much. And we had a good group, and we'll share this out to some more folks and pass the message around.
Oh, yes. And as I mentioned, the entire presentation is available to Native Plant Society and anybody. It should be considered public domain. So I will talk with you, Deb, about how y'all can, we can send it to you. I need to check to make sure all the photos are properly credited and that I have all the literature cited. But anyway, you can take this and you can just use individual photographs or slides, or you could mix and match it and use it as a base to make another talk with, or do whatever you want to with it.
Okay, that's fantastic. I really appreciate it. It's very useful information.
Great.
So thank you again. And